The Midwinter Visitor, A Ghost Story for Christmas. Chapter 1. Rookspur Manor. Rookspur Manor stood in the heart of the English countryside, surrounded on all sides by the luscious forest. It was the ancestral home of the McCarthy family, who had resided there for generations. This Christmas, Mr. McCarthy had decided to take his family away for the holidays, and so had enlisted the help of a man from a nearby village to look after the house while they were away. Unlike most families of a similar status, the McCarthys had few servants, preferring to do most things for themselves. As they were going away for Christmas, they had sent their servants home. Mrs. McCarthy had been visiting the village market when she bumped into Nicholas Fulwell. Nicholas had no close family, and Mrs. McCarthy thought he would be ideal to look after their house during their trip. She took him straight back to the manor that very day and presented him to her husband. After a thorough interview, Nicholas was given the job and told to report back to the manor in a week's time. When he returned, Nicholas was given an extensive tour of the house and told that the pantry had been fully stocked, so there would be no reason for him to leave the house. As his family got into the carriage waiting for them, Mr. McCarthy took Nicholas aside and spoke to him in private. "This is a personal matter, Nicholas, which is why I did not discuss it with you while my family was present. I have a strong suspicion that a visitor will come to this house while we are away. On no account must they be admitted. Do you understand?" Nicholas nodded. He wanted to ask why the visitor was not to be admitted, but knew that if Mr. McCarthy hadn't even told his wife the visitor was expected, then there was little chance that he, an outsider to the family, would be told. Mr. McCarthy patted Nicholas on the shoulder and left to join his family, shutting the door behind him and leaving Nicholas alone in Rookspur Manor. Chapter 2. Settling in. Nicholas wasted no time in making sure that any visitors would be discouraged. He drew all the curtains to make it seem like no one was home. In case his ruse was suspected, he barred the front door and the windows on the ground floor. Nicholas was sure that no one would risk climbing up the manor's walls in the bitingly cold weather outside. Mr. McCarthy had told him of when they intended to come back, so he knew that they wouldn't be caught out by his preparations. For a few days, nothing happened. Nicholas busied himself with making sure that the McCarthy's house remained clean. In his spare time, Nicholas worked his way through the McCarthy's extensive book collection. He had always fancied himself as a scholar of sorts, but life had not given him the opportunities he needed. Now, in the solace of the McCarthy's library, he could lose himself in years of studies and imagine a life for himself where he was a famous professor touring the country, giving lectures. He dined well, too. The food in the McCarthy's pantry was better than anything that had passed his lips before. Chapter 3. The Visitor Arrives. Nicholas was dreaming. He was dreaming of giving a lecture to a hall crammed with attentive students. "You have no doubt heard about the giant tortoise discovered in the Galapagos by the expedition that our alumnus Charles Darwin is on. Should a specimen find its way to our establishment, I am sure that it will provide a valuable opportunity for study." A hand shoots up. "Yes, Perkins?" "Sir, I heard that no specimens have made it back because the sailors eat them, sir. Is this true?" "And where did you hear that, Perkins?" "My father said his friend told him, sir." "Well, Perkins, I have no wish to sully the reputation of your father's friend, but I find it highly unlikely. These are men of science, not mindless animals. They know the importance of preserving life specimens. I would advise you not to believe everything you hear, unless it is said by a lecturer within these walls, of course." Nicholas woke with a start. He felt a chill go through him. He glanced over into the living room. The fire was still roaring in its hearth, so he couldn't have been asleep long. He turned his attention to the door. Nicholas had taken to sleeping in an armchair he had moved into the hallway, so that if there was any disturbance outside, he would be ready to deal with it quickly. There was no crack in the door, nor anything else that would account for the sensation that had passed through him. Despite the apparent ordinariness of the situation, Nicholas felt uneasy. He reached down and picked up the poker that lay beside him, then got to his feet. A shape began to materialize in front of the doorway. Nicholas blinked and focused his eyes, thinking he must still be dreaming. He realized that he had been mistaken. This thing, whatever it was, wasn't materializing in front of the doorway. It was coming through it. He pinched himself several times, each one harder than the last, in an effort to wake himself up, but to no avail. He realized with horror that he must be awake and that this phantom was real. A second thought entered his mind, that this phantom was the visitor Mr. McCarthy had warned him about. If that was the case, then all his preparations had been for naught. How had Mr. McCarthy expected him to refuse admittance to this, whatever it was? As the phantom hovered in the doorway, the shock got the better of Nicholas, and he crumpled into the armchair in a dead faint, the poker hitting the floor with a loud thud. The phantom stayed where it was, hovering and shimmering.
"What a predictable response,"
it said. When Nicholas came to, he found that the phantom was still hovering in the doorway. Now that he knew for sure that he was not dreaming, Nicholas was even more terrified. What was this thing, and what did it want with the McCarthys? It seemed to be regarding him with a curious expression. At least, that was what Nicholas thought. Its head was tilted to one side, as if it was examining him, but this was the only clue. The phantom was featureless, a man-shaped being dressed in robes and shrouded in mist. Where the head and limbs would have protruded from the clothes, there was only blackness. Then the phantom spoke, breaking the pall of silence that hung in the air.
"You are not McCarthy."
"No, the family are on holiday." Despite his nerves, Nicholas knew that the only way to get answers would be to engage in conversation with this unearthly visitor. "They asked me to look after the house while they were away. How did you know I wasn't McCarthy?"
"I have been watching them. I've been waiting for this day."
"What, Christmas? Have you a present for them or something?"
"McCarthy has something to give to me. If it is Christmas, why are you not with your family? Why do you sit in this empty house?"
"I have no family of my own. No close relations, anyway. Mrs. McCarthy met me in the village and asked if I would be interested in looking after their house while they were away. They're paying me well enough, though, so I don't mind." The phantom shook its head, or at least shook where its head would be if it had one.
"That is a shame. A man should have his family by his side. It is also a shame that McCarthy has got you involved in our business."
"Oh, and what business would that be? I am involved now, as you say, so surely you can tell me." The phantom pondered this for a minute.
"Very well, I shall tell you, but not here. Take this chair back to the living room. My appearance brings with it a chill. It would do well for you to be by the fire."
The phantom drifted past Nicholas and into the living room. Nicholas picked up the chair and followed. Nicholas sat by the fire, warming himself. The phantom was hovering in the chair opposite him, trying to give the illusion that it, too, was sitting down.
"Are you sitting comfortably?"
Nicholas nodded.
"Then I shall begin."
Chapter 4. The Phantom's Tale.
It was many generations ago. The head of the McCarthy family at that time was a town councillor. He had served at his post dutifully for several years when tragedy struck. This was the time of the Black Death. At the first sign of plague within the walls of this town, Councillor McCarthy fled. He claimed he was acting in the town's interests, that by leaving and avoiding the risk of catching the plague, he would be able to return and help the townsfolk rather than suffer along with them. But they suspected the truth. They were right. Councillor McCarthy never returned to the town until the plague was well and truly over, but by then it was too late. The majority of the villagers had perished either from the plague or from the blaze that ripped through the town after a purification fire got out of control. Hatred for McCarthy burned in the hearts of the few that survived. Of course, in the eyes of those who were in charge of law and order, the rich and the powerful, McCarthy's peers, he had done no wrong. He was given a job on another town council, and the affair was forgotten about. Forgotten about, that is, except by the survivors of McCarthy's negligence. They wanted revenge, and so strong was their desire that unnatural forces were set in motion. I am a composite of the souls of all those townsfolk who perished in that dreadful event. I have been following the McCarthy family since, and exacting my revenge. Councillor McCarthy was 35 years of age at the time, and it is on the 35th birthday of the head of the McCarthy family that I strike. It is fortunate that the current head was born near to Christmas. The walls between the human and spirit worlds are thin at this time. He has tried to run from me, but he cannot run forever. Soon he will return, and soon I shall get what I have come for.
Nicholas waited for a minute to make sure that the phantom had finished talking, then spoke up. "But if all this happened centuries ago, then why are you still seeking vengeance?"
Many people died because of Councillor McCarthy. The family must pay for every one of them.
Chapter 5. The McCarthys Return. The phantom had decided to wait for the McCarthys to return. Its presence unnerved Nicholas, and while he had tried to hide it, he was sure that it was aware, as it kept away from him most of the time and mainly hovered in Mr. McCarthy's study. Nicholas had dismantled his defenses, certain that the sight of the phantom would scare anybody away. He had conversed with it on several occasions since it had told him the story of the McCarthys. Once it had spoke with relish about how it got rid of each of Mr. McCarthy's ancestors in turn as they passed by their portraits. Then the inevitable happened. Nicholas was dusting the mantelpiece when he heard the front door open, and the sound of the McCarthy's children laughing. He went to greet them. "Oh, Nicholas, the place is spotless. Any trouble while we were away?" "No, sir." "What about that personal matter I talked to you about? Any visitors?" "There was one, sir, but I'm not sure if they were quite what you were expecting." Mr. McCarthy's face fell. "What are you talking about, Nicholas? Who came?" Nicholas felt the chill run through him that forewarned of the phantom's appearance. He turned to see it coming down the stairs.
"I did, McCarthy."
The two children shrieked, and Mrs. McCarthy gasped. Mr. McCarthy went deathly pale. "Oh, my God!"
"No,"
said the phantom.
"though it would be better for you if I was."
"What is it?" asked Mrs. McCarthy. "I don't know, dear," replied her husband.
"Of course not,"
said the phantom.
"Your family has long forgotten its crimes."
Realization dawned on Mr. McCarthy's face. "The family curse." "What?" asked his wife. "For generations, the head of my family has perished on their 35th birthday. I thought it was the work of a mortal man. It seems I was mistaken." "It was yours a few days ago."
"Precisely,"
said the phantom.
"And now I have come to claim your life as forfeit."
Mr. McCarthy reached into a drawer and pulled out a revolver. He emptied it into the phantom, who stayed hovering.
"Such ephemeral toys cannot hurt me."
The spirit hovered closer to Mr. McCarthy, who reached down into his shirt and pulled out a cross necklace.
"And such trinkets have no effect on me, McCarthy."
"My ancestors may have surrendered to you, but I refuse. Leave this place at once. I have a loving wife and a darling son and daughter, and you shall not take me away from them." The phantom was silent for a moment as it considered its options.
"Then I shall take them away from you."
The blackness that protruded from the phantom's robes extended until it smothered Mr. McCarthy's wife and children. Mr. McCarthy watched on in horror as their faces contorted in agony, their mouths hanging open in a silent scream as their lifeless bodies slid to the floor. "No!" he yelled.
"You have no choice but to join me now, McCarthy. That is, if you want to see your family again."
McCarthy sighed, resigned to his fate. Then a thought struck him and he smiled. "But what about the curse? Once I'm dead, there will be no one to pass it on to."
"You have other relatives. One of those will fill the gap you have left. The curse shall continue."
McCarthy sighed again, and then stepped into the phantom's blackness. His face contorted in agony. Then he fell down to the ground, dead. Nicholas fainted. Chapter 6. The Secret of the McCarthys. Mr. McCarthy was happy to be reunited with his family. His children were confused about what had happened, but he told them that they would soon be going to heaven. "I wouldn't give up just yet," came a voice. Mr. McCarthy spun round, and his eyes widened in shock. "Father, we've been waiting for you, and how nice of you to bring your family along. What are you talking about?" "Now we have enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough power to fight that thing." "How?" "You'll see. Follow me." His father walked off. Despite his family's protestations, Mr. McCarthy followed them. His own family followed him, trying to persuade him to come back. McCarthy's father led him to a building that outwardly resembled Rookspur Manor. He opened the door and beckoned them in. Inside were the ghosts of all of McCarthy's ancestors. "We're all here," said his father. "All of us that thing's killed, and now we're strong enough to give it a damn good kicking and send it back where it came from. This is the spot where you died, isn't it?" "I don't know," replied Mr. McCarthy. "I wasn't looking." "Well, it will be close enough, I'm sure." He turned to the other spirits. "It's time. Coalesce." McCarthy and his family watched as all the spirits approached his father and joined together to become one. The Gestalt entity turned back to McCarthy and reached out a hand.
"Join us."
McCarthy went to take the hand, but his wife held him back. "It might not be safe." "What's the worst that could happen? We're already dead." He took his father's hand and was pulled into the Gestalt. His wife, who was still holding his hand, was pulled in too. The children reached out to grab their mother and completed the entity. The phantom was standing over Nicholas's unconscious body. He was sick of people fainting in his presence and was wondering if there was anything he could do about it when a bright light filled the room and the McCarthy Gestalt appeared.
"This is not possible,"
the phantom roared.
"I'm afraid it is,"
said the McCarthy Gestalt.
"You're not the only being able to bring spirits together. We're more powerful than you now. Leave this realm, and promise to never return, or we shall banish you."
"Never."
"Then you shall leave us no choice."
The McCarthy Gestalt snapped its fingers, and a portal opened behind the phantom and began to suck it through. The phantom wailed as it struggled to no avail against the portal's force.
"No!"
The phantom disappeared, and the portal snapped shut. A voice rang out. "Thank you for that. He was playing havoc with my duties. Curses always cause discrepancies in the records." The McCarthy Gestalt turned round and found itself face to face with death. Chapter 7. An Accord with Death. "First things first. Let's separate this mess you've gotten yourselves into." Death flicked its hand through the air, and the Gestalt entity separated back into individual spirits. "Won't this mean that thing can come back?" asked McCarthy's father. "No. All that is required is your presence. The banishment is tied to your existence as spirits. You do not need to be combined." "What about my family?" asked Mr. McCarthy. "They were not supposed to be part of this. Surely they can be returned to life without the curse hanging over them." "If that happens, you will not have enough energy to sustain the banishment." "How much energy will we lack?" "Only 1 spirit's worth, but I would not ask you to choose between your children. I am not that cruel." "Your death." "Death is, for the most part, a natural phenomenon. I am merely its agent." "If the lack of energy could be resolved, then could my family be saved?" "Of course. But how would you do such a thing?" Mr. McCarthy walked into the living room and came out brandishing a letter opener, which he thrust into the still unconscious Nicholas's throat. Nicholas's spirit appeared and looked around in shock. Death turned to Mr. McCarthy. "I did not think you would resort to murder, Mr. McCarthy." "I would do anything to save my family. It won't affect the energy, will it?
No.
Death snapped its fingers, and a portal appeared behind Mr. McCarthy's wife and children.
Go through there, and you shall be returned to life.
They begin to head towards the portal. Mrs. McCarthy turns back to her husband. Come on, then. Mr. McCarthy takes a step towards the portal, but Death puts out an arm to stop him.
He must not go.
What? Why not?
Because there will not be enough energy, and then the curse shall return to your children.
Don't worry, dear, said Mr. McCarthy.
I would be dead anyway. I shall rest in peace, knowing that you are safe. I may be permitted to say goodbye?
Of course, replied Death. Mr. McCarthy, tears in his eyes, went over and hugged his crying children.
Make me proud. Will you?
His children nodded. Mr. McCarthy turned his attention to his wife, who had her hands clamped to her face. He removed them and kissed her one final time, putting an arm around her. After a minute or so, he removed her from his embrace and held her hands.
I shall miss you,
she said, her voice trembling with emotion.
I know,
said her husband.
But when the time comes, I shall be waiting for you.
He let go of her hands.
Now go, while I can still bear it.
Mrs. McCarthy and her children walked through the portal. When they were on the other side, they took one last tear-filled look at Mr. McCarthy before the portal closed, separating them for a long time. Back alive in their manor, Mrs. McCarthy and her children began to wake up. They got to their feet and looked around them, confused. When they saw the body of Mr. McCarthy and remembered what had happened, they dropped to their knees and prayed for his soul, crying silently. The Midwinter Visitor, A Ghost Story for Christmas, was written by Toby Hall and read by Glenda Villamar. Merry Christmas.